She washed other people's clothes for $1.50 a day. 14 years later, she owned a factory, a mansion on the Hudson, and an army of 20,000 saleswomen. And the title history gave her is the one thing about her that might not be true. Before we go on, if stories like this are why you love history, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming. You have probably heard her described in one line: the first self-made female millionaire in America. It's on the stamps, in the textbooks, in the headlines. We are going to come back to that line at the end of this because it is more complicated than it sounds, and because what she actually built was bigger than the title she's remembered for. But it starts in a cotton field in Louisiana. On the 23rd of December, 1867, on a plantation just outside Delta, Louisiana, a girl was born in a sharecropper's cabin and named Sarah Breedlove. Her parents, Owen and Minerva, had been enslaved on that same land. Her 4 older siblings had been born into slavery. Sarah was the first person in her family to be born free. That is the whole beginning of this story, and it's worth sitting inside it for a second. She arrived 2 years after the end of the Civil War into a family that had just been handed freedom and nothing else. No land, no money, no schooling. Freedom and a cotton field, and the same landowner's crop to bring in. By the time she was 7, both her parents were dead. She went to live with her older sister, Louisiana, and Louisiana's husband, a man named Jesse Powell, and by every account he was cruel to her. She picked cotton. She did laundry. She was, at 7 and 8 and 9 years old, working like an adult in the fields of Delta and across the river in Vicksburg, Mississippi. At 14, she married a man named Moses McWilliams. She said later, plainly, that she married in order to get out of that house. She was 17 when her daughter was born, a girl named Lelia, on the 6th of June, 1885. And she was 20 when Moses died and left her a widow with a 2-year-old child and no way to feed her. So she made a decision that hundreds of thousands of Black Americans were making in those same decades. She went north to the city. She chose St. Louis because 4 of her brothers had gone there and set themselves up as barbers. And in St. Louis, she found the work that was available to a Black woman with no education in 1889. She became a washerwoman. Understand what that job was? Not a machine, not a service. It was hauling water, heating it over fire, scrubbing other people's clothes by hand against a board with lye soap that stripped the skin off your knuckles, wringing them, hanging them, and doing it again, for hours, every day, in steam, bent over a tub. For that, she earned as little as $1.50 a day, and she did it for roughly a decade and a half. But here is the first thing that tells you who she was. Out of $1.50 a day, she saved enough to put her daughter through the public schools of St. Louis. Every day of it. And when she could, she went to night school herself, because she had almost no formal education, and she knew exactly what that was costing her. There is a line she used later in life, and it is the best summary of her that anyone has ever managed, including her. I got my start by giving myself a start. St. Louis gave her one more thing, and it turned out to matter enormously. She joined St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. Through it, she met women of the National Association of Colored Women, organized, educated, ambitious Black women who ran clubs and campaigns and networks across the whole country. Sarah Breedlove was a laundress standing in a room full of women who thought in terms of national organizations. She was watching how a network functioned. Remember that, because in about 15 years, she is going to build one of the most effective distribution networks in America out of exactly this material. And then, in the 1890s, her hair started falling out. Not thinning. Coming out in patches, leaving bare and painful areas across her scalp. This was not unusual, and the reasons were brutally practical. Most American homes had no indoor plumbing, so people, everyone of every background, washed their hair rarely, sometimes once a month. The soaps available were harsh, often lye-based. Diets were poor, and Sarah spent her days bent over steaming water in an unventilated room, then walked out into cold air with a damp scalp. Add the hair treatments available to black women at the time, many of them aggressive, and scalp disease was widespread. For a woman in 1890s America, losing your hair was not a cosmetic inconvenience. It was a public humiliation in a century that measured a woman's respectability by her appearance. Sarah later spoke about how ashamed she was of it, so she started looking for something that worked. She asked her brothers, who were barbers. She tried homemade remedies, and she tried the products of another black woman who deserves to be named properly in this story. Annie Turnbo Malone. Malone was a chemist by inclination, born in Illinois, who had built a hair care line for black women called Poro, a name taken from a West African word. She had done something almost nobody in American business was doing. She had looked at a market that every major manufacturer ignored completely and built products specifically for it. She sold door to door. She trained agents. She would go on to build an enormous business, a college, an orphanage, and a fortune of her own. And around 1904, Annie Malone hired Sarah Breedlove as a commission sales agent. This is the most important job Sarah ever had, and it was not because of the commission. For the first time in her life, she was inside a functioning business, learning how a product was made, how it was priced, how it was demonstrated on a doorstep, how a woman with no shop and no capital could sell something to a stranger and come back next month. She was 36 years old. She had been a laundress for 15 years, and she was, without quite knowing it yet, doing an apprenticeship. In July of 1905, Sarah moved to Denver. She went as a sales agent, with about $1.50 in savings by some accounts, and the mountain air was supposed to be good for her health. And in Denver, she started mixing her own preparation. She always said the formula came to her in a dream, that a large black man appeared and told her what to mix, that some of the ingredients came from Africa, that she sent for them and tried it, and her hair grew back. That's her account, and it's worth being honest that it was also very good marketing. What we can say is that the preparation she settled on was a sulfur-based scalp ointment, in a tradition of such preparations that had existed for around a century, combined with a regimen. Wash the hair regularly, treat the scalp, comb it out, care for it consistently. In 1906, she married Charles Joseph Walker, a St. Louis newspaperman who knew advertising and mail order, and she took his name, but not the way most women did. She did not become Mrs. Walker. She became Madam C.J. Walker. That decision was pure commercial instinct, and it may be the smartest single thing she ever did. Madam carried the authority of the French beauty houses, the ones respectable women already trusted. It was a title. It signaled expertise, not domesticity. It made a formerly illiterate laundress from Delta, Louisiana, into a professional with standing in 2 words on a tin. And she put her own face on that tin. Think about what that means in 1906. Advertising of the period represented black people almost exclusively through grotesque caricature. Walker put a photograph of a dignified, well-dressed black woman, herself, On every container, in every newspaper advertisement, in every black paper in the country. Before she sold a single jar to most of those women, she had shown them an image of a black woman being taken seriously. Then she went to work, and the work was relentless. She traveled. For a year and a half, she moved through the South and the Southeast, city after city, and she did not advertise and wait. She went to churches. She went to black women's club meetings, the same kind of rooms she had been sitting in St. Louis. She stood in front of gatherings and demonstrated on real women's hair, and she told them her own story, the cotton field, the washtub, the hair loss, because her biography was the proof. And then she made the move that turned a product into an empire. She did not just sell them the ointment, she offered them the job. The Walker agent system worked like this. A woman paid a small amount to be trained in the Walker method. She received the products at agent price, a certificate, and the right to call herself a Walker beauty culturist. She then sold and applied the treatments in her own community, in her neighbors' kitchens, in her own front room, eventually in her own shop. She kept a substantial share of what she made. Now, look at what that meant to the woman on the other side of the doorstep in 1910. The jobs realistically available to a black woman in America at that moment were domestic service, laundry, cooking, and field work. All of them paid a few dollars a week. All of them meant working in someone else's house, under someone else's supervision, at someone else's convenience. A Walker agent could make several times that. She set her own hours. She had her own customers. She answered to nobody in the room. Walker was not selling hair grower. She was selling economic independence in a country that had made very sure it was almost impossible for these women to obtain any. They came in their thousands. By 1917, the company claimed to have trained close to 20,000 women. Some accounts put the sales force at 25,000. In 1908, she moved the operation to Pittsburgh and opened Lelia College, named for her daughter, to train agents formally. In 1910, she moved again to Indianapolis, then the largest inland manufacturing city in the country, sitting on 8 railway lines. There she built a factory, a laboratory, a salon, and a training school. A woman who had been scrubbing other people's shirts 11 years earlier was now running a vertically integrated manufacturing company. In 1912, she went to the annual convention of the National Negro Business League, the organization founded by Booker T. Washington, the most powerful black man in America. Washington had not invited her to speak. By the accounts that survive, he passed over her twice. So on the third day, Madam C.J. Walker stood up from the convention floor without being called and addressed the room anyway. And she said this: "I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the washtub. From there, I was promoted to the cook kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations." She was invited to address the convention as a featured speaker the following year. By 1917, she had built something that had no real precedent, and that year, she did something with it that nobody expected. On the 31st of August, 1917, she gathered more than 200 of her agents at Union Baptist Church in Philadelphia for the first national convention of Walker beauty culturists. It is regarded as one of the earliest national conventions of businesswomen ever held in the United States. She gave out prizes. And here is the detail that tells you what she was actually building. She gave prizes to the women who had sold the most, but she also gave prizes to the local Walker clubs that had contributed the most time and money to charity in their own communities. She was using a sales force as a civic organization. She had turned 20,000 saleswomen into 20,000 organized, funded, connected Black women with their own money and their own clubs in towns across America. And that convention met at a terrible moment. 6 weeks earlier, in July of 1917, white mobs had attacked the Black community of East St. Louis, Illinois. At least 39 African Americans were killed. Thousands were driven from their homes. In response, on the 28th of July, roughly 10,000 people walked down Fifth Avenue in New York City in complete silence. No chanting, no speeches, only the sound of muffled drums. Adults dressed in black, children and women dressed in white, carrying banners asking the country a series of very simple questions about its own principles. It is remembered as the Silent Protest Parade, and Madam C.J. Walker was on the committee that organized it. At her Philadelphia convention, she led her delegates in sending a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson, urging him to support making lynching a federal crime. And on the 1st of August, 1917, she traveled to Washington with a small delegation of Harlem leaders, led by James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP, to deliver an anti-lynching petition to the White House in person. They had been promised a meeting with the president at noon. When they arrived, they were informed that Wilson was too busy to see them. They handed the petition to his secretary instead, and went up to Capitol Hill to meet the handful of members of Congress who would receive them. An anti-lynching bill would not become federal law in the United States until 2022, more than a century later. Walker kept going anyway. She joined the executive committee of the New York NAACP. She sat on the management committee of the Harlem YWCA. She chaired the Circle for Negro War Relief. She gave the largest single donation towards saving Frederick Douglass's house in Washington. And she pledged $5,000 to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund. At that point, the largest gift the organization had ever received from any individual. She was also, at the same time, being recruited by the federal government to encourage Black Americans to buy war bonds, while that same government placed her on a list of Negro subversives because she kept speaking up about the treatment of Black soldiers. In the spring of 1918, she moved into the house she had built on the Hudson River at Irvington-on-Hudson, New York. 34 rooms. She called it Villa Lewaro, and she chose her architect deliberately. Vertner Woodson Tandy, the first Black architect licensed in the state of New York. Villa Lewaro was not a retirement. Walker said openly what it was for. She wanted a house that would stand in a neighborhood of America's wealthiest white industrialists and be undeniable. A permanent physical argument about what Black Americans could build. And she intended it as a gathering place for Black leaders, which is exactly what it became. She lived in it for about a year. On the 25th of May, 1919, Madam C.J. Walker died at Villa Lewaro. She was 51. The cause was kidney failure and complications of hypertension, the pressure, quite literally, of the life she had lived. In her will, she left roughly $100,000 to more than 30 organizations and individuals, and she wrote into the company's governing structure that its president must always be a woman. So, the title. Almost every account of her life leads with it. The first self-made female millionaire in America. The Guinness Book of World Records lists her that way, a woman who neither inherited a fortune nor married one. Here is what's actually documented. At her death, her estate was valued at somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000. A staggering sum, several million in today's money, but not $1 million. Her company's sales in her final year exceeded $500,000, which makes the business itself worth a great deal more. Guinness itself notes that the exact extent of her wealth is difficult to establish. Some argue Annie Malone reached that level first, though Malone's finances are far less well documented than Walker's. And Madam C.J. Walker, during her own lifetime, denied that she was a millionaire. Her great-great-granddaughter, Alelia Bundles, who has spent decades in the family archives and wrote the definitive biography, has said the argument over who got there first has become petty and contrived, and that the real measure of Walker is not the number. It's the jobs. It's 20,000 women who stopped working in other people's houses. It's a factory in Indianapolis and a college in Pittsburgh. It's the largest donation the NAACP had ever received. It's the first national convention of black businesswomen in America. It's a company charter that required a woman at the top. It's a photograph of a dignified black woman on a tin in 100,000 homes, at a time when the rest of American advertising was doing the exact opposite. The millionaire question is the smallest true thing about her. Madam C.J. Walker's story reminds us that the people who change the world are rarely the ones who found a way to get rich. They're the ones who found a way to bring everybody else along with them.